Scalextric survived the Clockwork crash of the 1950s, survived a corporate takeover in 1958, survived the collapse of the largest toy company in Britain. It didn't survive Full Flood Road, the factory in Havant, the one that made the sets, the one that employed 1,200 people, the one whose products smelled of hot motors and something sharp and electrical that children would remember 50 years later. Closed by the early 1970s. The buildings came down, a business park went up. Today, the address reads like every other light industrial estate in southern England. Units, logistics, flexible terms. The kind of place you drive past without slowing down. The toy still exists, the brand still sells. But the making of it left this town half a century ago, and what replaced it carries no memory of what stood here. No plaque, no display, no sign that this patch of Hampshire once turned British living rooms into racetracks. The silence at Full Flood Road is the loudest thing in this story. It starts with a man called Fred Francis, and a workshop, and a car that wouldn't stop selling. There's a road in Havant called New Lane. It runs through the kind of light industrial landscape you could find in any town in southern England. Signage for security firms and retail suppliers, metal fencing, tidy car parks, units with roller shutters. The vocabulary of modern Britain, logistics, warehousing, business solutions. Nothing about it suggests that anything remarkable ever happened here. 36 New Lane. Say the address to anyone under 50 and you'll get nothing, a blank. Say it to the right person over 60, someone who grew up in Hampshire or who spent a particular kind of Christmas morning on their hands and knees on the living room carpet, and you might get something different. A flicker, a half memory. Not of this address exactly, but of what once came out of it. Because 36 New Lane, Havant, was where Scalextric was first manufactured. The toy that turned dining tables into Monza. The one that smelled of something. A sharp, metallic bite around the transformer and the little motors. What people remember as ozone. Though whether it was truly ozone or simply the scent of electrical discharge and hot copper brushes hardly matters now. What matters is that the smell was real and specific and powerful enough that grown men in their 70s can close their eyes and be 8 years old again, lying on their stomachs, thumb on the controller, watching a tiny car take the hairpin. That smell. The click-clack of track sections locking together. That particular satisfying snap of plastic meeting plastic, the flex of the joints, the moment a circuit became complete and the whole thing hummed to life. The whine of small motors winding up. These were the sounds and sensations of a ritual that defined Christmas in millions of British homes. And the factory that made it all possible sat here, on this road, in this town. Today, the registered occupant of 36 New Lane is QVIS, a company in the security and retail technology trade. A perfectly legitimate business, doing perfectly ordinary work. There is nothing on the building, nothing on the street, nothing in the surrounding landscape to tell you that this was once the birthplace of the most famous slot car racing system in the world. Drive a mile southeast to Full Flood Road, the road that once held the larger factory, the one that at its peak employed around 1,200 people. And the erasure is just as thorough. The road name persists, the industrial character persists, but the language has changed. Property brochures describe it as the location of Dunsbury Business Park. Units available, flexible terms, ample parking, not a word about toy cars. This is not the kind of ruin you can photograph. There are no crumbling walls, no rusted machinery left out in the rain, no dramatic collapse to point a camera at. The ruin is subtler than that. It's the fact that nothing looks like one. The factory didn't fall down. It was replaced, tidied away, redeveloped, overwritten by the generic language of commercial property. And the community of work that once filled these buildings simply dispersed. The way a crowd disperses after the last race is run. Scalextric still exists, of course. You can buy a set today, online, from a toy shop, from any number of retailers. The brand survived. The product survived in evolved form. What didn't survive was the making of it here in Havant by the people of Havant. And that distinction between a brand that endures and a place that falls quiet is what this story is about. It begins, as these stories often do, with one man and a workshop, and a problem he couldn't quite solve with Clockwork. Bertram Francis, everyone called him Fred, was a tool maker. Not a dreamer, not a visionary in the way that word gets used now, but something more grounded and, in its way, more admirable. A man who understood how things were made, how metal could be cut and pressed and shaped, how mechanisms worked, how a well-designed tool could turn a complicated job into a repeatable one. He'd founded a small tool-making firm before the war, Francis and Company, established in 1939, the kind of outfit that made the instruments other people needed to make their products. It was precise, unglamorous work, and it gave him something that would prove more valuable than any patent, an instinct for production. Not just, can we design this, but can we make 1,000 of them reliably by Friday? After the war in 1947, he pivoted, founded a new company, Minimodels Ltd, and began producing tinplate toys in London. The timing was shrewd or perhaps simply inevitable. Britain in the late 1940s was a country rebuilding, and part of that rebuilding was the return of ordinary domestic life. Children needed toys. Factories needed work. The toy trade offered both. Fred Francis wasn't interested in soft things. Stuffed animals, dolls, anything that required fabric and sentiment. He was a metal worker. His toys would be mechanical. They'd move. They'd do something. And the thing they did, before Scalextric was even a word, was race. Scalex arrived in 1952. The name was a compression of scale and X, suggesting precision, modernity, a hint of the scientific. The product was a Clockwork racing car, tinplate-bodied, roughly 1:32 scale, powered by a spring motor and guided by an ingenious mechanism that later histories would describe as a fifth wheel, a small guide wheel beneath the car that kept it on a track. You wound the car, set it down, and watched it go. Simple. Tactile. Completely absorbing for the child, or if we're honest, the father, who held it. The cars were beautifully made in that mid-century tinplate way. Stamped metal bodies with lithograph detailing, bright colours, a satisfying weight in the hand. They felt like real things. Miniature machines, not abstractions. And they sold. They sold remarkably well. At the height of Scalex production, one local history account places weekly output at over 7,000 models. 7,000 Clockwork cars a week, pouring out of a small works and into toy shops across the country. For a company of around 100 employees, that was a formidable pace. The kind of production rhythm that leaves very little room for error and no room at all for complacency. But Clockwork had a problem. Clockwork ran down. You wound the car. It raced, it slowed, it stopped. You picked it up, wound it again. The ritual was charming for a while, but it imposed a ceiling on the experience. The cars couldn't be controlled, not really. You set them off and hoped. There was no throttle, no modulation, no sense of driving. It was winding and watching, and by the mid-1950s, the novelty was fading. Sales softened. The Clockwork craze, which had seemed so robust, began to cool. By 1956, the position was precarious. Multiple accounts describe mini-models facing a future that looked uncertain, not catastrophic, not yet, but fragile. 100-odd workers. A product line losing its momentum. A founder who understood, with the instinct of a toolmaker, that the mechanism needed to change. What happened next wasn't a lightning bolt of inspiration. It was workshop logic. Francis and his team began experimenting with electric motors, small, cheap DC motors that could be fitted into the existing tinplate car bodies. The question wasn't whether a toy car could be electrified. That was straightforward enough. The question was how you'd control it, how you'd deliver power to a car moving freely along a track, and how you'd let the person holding the controller decide when to accelerate and when to ease off. The solution was the slot, a groove cut into the track surface with twin metal rails set into it, carrying low-voltage current. The car sat on the track with a guide. A small insulated gimbal wheel, a two-piece affair that dropped into the slot and made contact with both rails simultaneously. Power flowed up through the guide, into the motor, and the car moved. Squeeze the controller harder, more current, more speed, ease off, and it slowed. Overdo it on a bend, and the car flew off the track entirely. Loss of contact, loss of power, instant drama. It was, in every sense that mattered, a system. Not just a toy, but a complete domestic infrastructure, track, power supply, controllers, cars. A self-contained world you could assemble on any flat surface in the house. The dining table, the bedroom floor, the carpet in front of the fire on Christmas morning. Fred Francis called it Scalextric. Scalextric. Compressed, modernised, unmistakable. He took it to Harrogate. The Harrogate International Toy Fair opened on the 12th of January 1957. It was the trade's annual gathering. Buyers, distributors, manufacturers, all converging on the Yorkshire spa town to see what would fill the shelves that coming Christmas. A ritual of its own. Handshakes, order books, prototypes laid out on draped tables, the quiet commerce that decided what British children would unwrap 10 months later. Fred Francis arrived with his electric racing system. Scalextric, as it was now called, displayed on a demonstration circuit. Rubber track with inset metal rails, tin plate cars fitted with the new gimbal wheel pickups, handheld controllers wired to a transformer. The cars on show included models of a Maserati 250F and a Ferrari 375. Grand Prix machines, scaled down to 1:32, carrying the glamour of continental motorsport into a Yorkshire exhibition hall. It's worth pausing on that choice. Not London buses, not Morris Minors, not sensible British saloons, Maseratis and Ferraris. The toy maker from Havant understood something about aspiration that went beyond engineering. Children didn't want to race what their fathers drove. They wanted to race what Stirling Moss drove, what Fangio drove. The cars they'd seen in newsreels, impossibly fast, impossibly far away. And now, for the price of a Christmas present, they could have them on the dining room table, under their own thumbs. The response at Harrogate was immediate. The word used most often in later accounts is immense. Orders flooded in, volumes that dwarfed what Minimodels could produce. Here was a small Hampshire company, 100 or so workers, a factory on New Lane in Havant, facing the best problem and the worst problem simultaneously. Everyone wanted what they'd made, and they couldn't make enough of it. That pressure, the exhilarating, terrifying gap between demand and capacity, would define the next 18 months. Every set shipped created 2 more customers who wanted one. Every Christmas that passed with unmet orders was revenue lost and frustration earned. The works ran at capacity. The order book grew, and Fred Francis confronted the reality that had undone countless British inventors before him. Having a brilliant product is not the same as having the machinery, the floor space, the capital, and the workforce to deliver it at scale. The sale came in 1958. Francis sold Minimodels to the Lines brothers, the family behind Triang, one of the largest toy manufacturers in Britain. The logic was unassailable. Triang had the factories, the distribution network, the plastics expertise, the capital. They could take Scalextric from a Hampshire workshop product to a mass-market phenomenon. And they did. This is not a villain's entrance. It's important to say that plainly, because in stories about British industry, the moment a small company sells to a larger one is often narrated as a betrayal, the corporate raider swallowing the plucky inventor. But the truth is more complicated and sadder. Francis wasn't betrayed. He made a rational decision. He couldn't meet the demand. He couldn't fund the expansion. Triang could. The sale saved the product, and in the short term, it saved the jobs. What it also did, and this is the part that only becomes visible decades later, was transfer the future. Not the present, but the future. From that moment on, Decisions about where Scalextric would be made, how many people would make it, and whether the Havant works would stay open would be taken not by a toolmaker who'd built the thing with his own hands, but by a corporate board weighing margins, logistics, and the performance of a portfolio. The invention survived. The inventor's authority over its fate did not. Back in Havant, though, the immediate effect was expansion. Triang's resources meant investment, new tooling, new materials. The transition from tinplate to plastic bodies was underway by 1960, a shift that changed the factory floor as profoundly as it changed the product. Pressed and plated metal gave way to injection moulds. The craft of the tinsmith yielded to the precision of the mould maker. The cars became lighter, more detailed, capable of greater variety, and they could be produced faster. The operation outgrew New Lane. A larger site was needed. More floor space, more storage, more room for the growing workforce. The company looked a mile to the southeast, to a new industrial estate being developed on the edge of Lee Park. Lee Park. The name matters because it places the Scalextric story inside a larger one. The story of post-war Britain rebuilding itself literally from the ground up. Portsmouth had taken a battering during the war. The dockyard was a primary target, and the surrounding residential streets absorbed the overspill of German bombs. By 1944, before the war had even ended, Portsmouth City Council was already planning for what would come after, the housing that tens of thousands of families would need. They bought the land that would become Lee Park, and in 1949 the first residents moved in. What followed was one of the largest council housing developments in southern England. Street after street of new homes, built through the 1950s, most of the construction completed by around 1960. A whole community assembled from scratch. Houses, schools, shops, churches. And the thing every new community needs most, work. An industrial estate was developed in the southeast corner of Lee Park in the mid-1950s. Minimodels, by local account, was the first factory to open there. A claim that, if it holds against the archival record, gives the Scalextric story a particular resonance. The toy works wasn't just another tenant on an industrial estate, it was the anchor. The first employer in a community that had been built explicitly to house workers who needed employing. The address was Full Flood Road, and by 1961 the larger factory there was operational. A purpose-built facility scaled to the ambition that Triang's ownership made possible. This was no longer a workshop. This was a works. The distinction matters. A workshop is where things are invented. A works is where they're produced at volume, by a community of hands, shift after shift, week after week, year after year. We know the address with certainty because it appears not just in company literature or nostalgic reminiscence, but in the driest, most reliable kind of industrial document, a patent filing. In 1970, a patent application listed the assignee as Minimodels Ltd, Full Flood Road, Havant, Hampshire, England. That's not memory, that's paperwork. The company was still innovating on Full Flood Road, still filing intellectual property from a factory floor in Lee Park, as late as the final years of the Havant era. And at its height, that factory employed around 1,200 people. 1,200. Let the number settle. This wasn't a boutique operation. This wasn't a small team of craftspeople turning out artisanal toys for a niche market. 1,200 workers, men and women arriving each morning, clocking in, taking their stations on a production floor that hummed with the particular energy of a works running at capacity. 1,200 wage packets, 1,200 families with a stake in the rhythm of this building. Imagine the floor. You'd walk in, and the first thing that hit you, before you registered the visual scale of it, was the sound. The clatter of injection moulding presses cycling, that repetitive pneumatic thump of moulds closing, the hiss of plastic being forced into shape, the higher whine of small motors being tested, dozens of them running simultaneously on test rigs, each one checked before it went into a car body. The rattle of track sections moving along conveyors, the scrape of metal rails being set into rubber or plastic channels. And beneath all of it, a baseline hum. The building itself vibrating with production. If you stood still and put your hand flat on a workbench, you could feel it. A low, continuous pulse that said the works was alive, running, making something. The air had its own character. Warm plastic. That distinctive, slightly sweet smell of freshly moulded polystyrene. Machine oil from the presses. Solder flux from the wiring stations where controllers and power units were assembled. And tea. Always tea. The canteen smell cutting through the industrial atmosphere, because this was a British factory in the 1960s, and the tea break was as essential to production as the raw materials. What they were making in relentless daily volume was not simply a toy, it was a system. Hundreds of components that had to work together with precision. Track sections, straight, curved, chicane, crossover, each one moulded to tight tolerances, so the rails aligned and the slot ran true. Cars, plastic bodies clipped over metal chassis, tiny DC motors wired in, rear axles fitted, guide flags or pickups mounted underneath. Controllers, rheostats in plastic housings, wired to plugs that connected to the power unit. The power unit itself, a transformer stepping mains voltage down to a safe 12 or 18 volts. Every element had to be right. A track section with a misaligned rail meant a car that stuttered or stopped. A motor that ran rough meant a car that juddered rather than swept. A controller with a dodgy contact meant frustration on Christmas morning. And frustrated customers didn't come back. The quality mattered, not in an abstract corporate mission statement way, but in the specific, practical way that anyone who's ever worked a production line understands. If you get it wrong, someone notices. The workers who assembled these systems weren't performing glamorous work. It was repetitive, detailed, manual, fitting tiny brushes into motor housings, pressing axles into wheels, snapping bodies onto chassis, checking. The rhythm of it would have been familiar to anyone who'd worked in any British assembly operation. The steady, practiced movements of people who did the same task hundreds of times a day and took quiet pride in doing it quickly, cleanly, and right. What distinguished this particular works? What gave it a warmth that a ball-bearing factory or a widget press might not have had? Was the product. These workers were making something that children loved, something that fathers loved, perhaps even more than their children did. Every car that left that production line was destined for a living room, a bedroom, a kitchen table cleared of plates and set up with a figure-of-8 track on a Saturday afternoon. The workers knew this. They knew where their product ended up and what it meant when it got there. Here is where the factory disappears and the ritual begins. Because the Scalextric story isn't really about what happened inside the works at Full Flood Road. It's about what happened after the product left the gates, packed into boxes, stacked on pallets, loaded onto lorries, delivered to shops, and carried home by parents who knew exactly what they were buying. Not a gift, an event. The box was the first act, heavy, heavier than a child expected. You'd feel the weight of it and know this wasn't a board game or a jigsaw puzzle. This was infrastructure. You'd peel back the lid and find the components nested in moulded packaging. The track sections, the cars, the controllers, the power unit, the instruction leaflet that nobody read properly. Everything you needed to build a world, and building it was half the joy. The track sections locked together with a snap, that click-clack that anyone who owned a set can replay in their mind without effort. Tab into slot, press down, feel the joint seat. Each connection was a small commitment. You were deciding the shape of the circuit, the line of the straights, the arc of the curves. You could follow the suggested layouts in the instruction booklet, or you could improvise. Stretching the track across the full width of the room, under the coffee table, around the legs of the sofa, creating circuits that tested the patience of every adult in the house who needed to walk from one side of the room to the other. The carpet was the usual surface, brown or green or orange. This was the 60s and 70s after all. The pile gave the track a slight flex, which meant the joints had to be firm. Get one wrong and you'd feel it during a race. The car would hesitate at the join, lose speed, sometimes derail entirely. The serious enthusiasts, and there were always serious enthusiasts, even among 9-year-olds, would migrate to harder surfaces. A large sheet of plywood in the garage. A dining table if the parents were tolerant enough. Anywhere flat, anywhere stable, anywhere the track could lie true. Then, the power unit, plugged into the wall, the controllers connected to the track, the cars placed gently into their slots, guide pickups dropping into the groove with a small, precise click, and then the moment, the switch. The transformer hummed. A faint vibration ran through the track, and if you squeezed the controller just slightly, the car twitched, alive. That first twitch, that was the magic. The car responding to your hand, not wound up and released, not battery-powered and autonomous, but connected, wired to your thumb. Press harder, it accelerated. Ease off, it slowed. Push too hard through a bend, and it flew off the track. Loss of control, loss of contact, the car tumbling across the carpet while your opponent's car swept through the gap. The racing itself was physical in a way that screens would never replicate. You leaned into it, literally. Children would lie flat on the floor, eye level with the track, watching the cars at what felt like scale speed. Adults would stand over the layout, controller in one hand, drink in the other, with a concentration that betrayed how little of this was really about the children. There was shouting, there was argument, there was the particular injustice of a car that was definitely faster than the other one, which led to elaborate swapping rituals and accusations of cheating that had nothing to do with cheating and everything to do with wanting to win. And the smell. Always the smell. The small DC motors ran hot under sustained use. The carbon brushes wore against the commutator. Electrical arcing, tiny, harmless, but continuous, produced that sharp, metallic scent. What many people remember as ozone. It hung in the air around the track, strongest near the power unit, and it became inseparable from the experience itself. You didn't just see Scalextric or hear it, you breathed it. And decades later, a whiff of something similar. An old electric motor, a model railway transformer, the particular tang of electrical discharge, could transport you back to that carpet, that room, that Christmas, with a vividness that no photograph could match. Research on autobiographical memory bears this out. Studies comparing odour-evoked memories to those triggered by visual or verbal cues consistently find that smell produces recollections rated as more emotional, more vivid, and more strongly transporting. The sensation of being pulled bodily back into a past moment. It's why the ozone memory isn't a decorative detail in this story. It's the mechanism by which the story survives in the people who lived it. The factory at Full Flood Road is gone. The track sets are in lofts and charity shops. But the smell endures in neural pathways, and when it's triggered, grown adults are suddenly lying on the carpet again, 8 years old, watching a tiny Lotus take the chicane. The living room was, in effect, the final assembly line. The factory made the components. The family completed the product. Every Christmas morning, every birthday, every wet Saturday afternoon, when there was nothing on the television, someone opened the box and built a circuit, and for a few hours the living room became Brands Hatch, became Silverstone, became Monaco, became whatever the imagination supplied, powered by 12 volts and a sharp smell of hot metal. That ritual, the building, the racing, the arguing, the smell, was Scalextric's true product. Not plastic and copper wire, but an experience. A domestic theatre of competition and togetherness. And it depended entirely on a works in Lee Park where 1,200 people came through the gates each morning and made it possible. By the early to mid-1960s, the Scalextric operation at Havant had reached its summit. The workforce at Full Flood Road was substantial. The product line was expanding. New cars, new track configurations, new accessories. The system had evolved from Fred Francis's original rubber track tin plate car prototype into something the company's own marketing described, with the particular confidence of the era, as the most complete model motor racing system in the world. It wasn't an idle boast. By the mid-60s, the range was formidable. Grand Prix cars, sports cars, saloons, rally cars. Each one detailed enough to satisfy the enthusiast, robust enough to survive the enthusiast's younger brother. The track system offered variety that could eat an entire afternoon of planning. Straights, curves in multiple radii, chicanes, crossovers, lap counters, bridges, banking. You could start with a simple oval and end up, 3 Christmases later, with a layout that colonised the spare bedroom. The brand had crossed from toy into culture. In 1964, a first Scalextric World Championship was held in London, hosted by Jim Clark, the reigning Formula One world champion no less. Think about that for a moment. The actual world champion of motor racing lending his name and his presence to a toy car competition. It tells you something about the seriousness with which the hobby was regarded and the cultural confidence of the brand at its height. This wasn't a novelty. It wasn't a passing craze. It was, for a particular slice of British domestic life, an institution. The Havant works was the engine of all of it. The cars, the track, the controllers, the sets, designed and produced on Full Flood Road, packed into boxes that would find their way into homes across the country and, increasingly, overseas. A patent filed in 1970 from the Full Flood Road address shows the company was still innovating there, still refining the system, still treating Havant as the centre of its engineering life. And if you'd stood on that factory floor in 1964 or 1965, perhaps during the filming of the City of Sailors documentary, when cameras captured colour footage of the works in motion, you'd have seen something that felt permanent. The presses running, the assembly lines moving, 1,200 people earning a living making something the whole country wanted. A works hooter marking the shifts. A canteen serving tea. The ordinary machinery of British industrial life, doing what it was supposed to do, providing work, producing goods, anchoring a community. It felt permanent. That's the cruelest part, because the decision that would determine the factory's fate had already been made, back in 1958, when Fred Francis sold to Triang. The sale that solved the immediate problem, how to meet demand, had also placed the future of the Havant works in the hands of a corporate structure that thought in terms of efficiency, consolidation, and cost. When Minimodels was an independent company, its factory was its identity. When Minimodels became a division of Triang, its factory became an asset on a balance sheet. And assets, when the arithmetic changes, get rationalised. Nobody standing in that works in the mid-1960s would have seen it coming. The order books were full. The product was dominant. The workforce was 1,200 strong. This was the peak, the highest point before everything changed. They just didn't know it yet. The thing about corporate ownership is that it works brilliantly, right up until it doesn't. And the mechanism by which it stops working is almost always the same. The priorities of the whole override the needs of the part. Minimodels by the mid-1960s was no longer Minimodels in any meaningful operational sense. It was a division, a line item in the Triang portfolio, one brand among many, managed from a distance, measured by its contribution to the group. The name persisted. The Havant address persisted. The workforce persisted. But the decision-making authority, the power to say, we expand, we invest, we stay, had migrated. It lived in boardrooms that most Full Flood Road workers would never see. This is not, in itself, unusual. It's how corporate Britain worked then and works now. A company grows beyond its founder's capacity, sells to a larger group, and accepts that strategic decisions will henceforth be made at a level where the view is wider, but the detail is thinner. The people making those decisions aren't malicious. They're managing complexity. They're reading spreadsheets, not walking factory floors. And the spreadsheets don't capture the sound of a works hooter, or the weight of 1,200 wage packets, or the fact that a community in Lee Park has built its daily rhythms around the shifts at Full Flood Road. By the late 1960s, the wider toy industry was shifting. Competition was intensifying, not just from other slot car manufacturers, but from new categories of play entirely. The post-war boom that had lifted all boats in the toy trade was levelling off. Margins were tightening, and the Lines Brothers empire, Triang, the parent company that had absorbed Minimodels a decade earlier, was feeling the strain. The signs, in hindsight, were legible. Triang had expanded aggressively through the 1950s and 1960s, acquiring brands and factories across Britain and beyond. It was, for a time, the largest toy company in the world. But size brought complexity, and complexity brought cost, and cost brought vulnerability. When market conditions softened, when growth slowed, when export markets became harder, when the easy years gave way to tighter ones, the empire's weight became its problem. Too many factories, too many product lines, too many overheads distributed across a structure that had been built for expansion, not contraction. The patent filed in 1970 from Full Flood Road, Minimodels Triang Ltd, tells you something quietly devastating. The company name on that document is a hybrid, the original identity fused with the corporate parent. Minimodels hadn't disappeared. It had been absorbed, integrated into a system whose logic was no longer about what was best for Scalextric or for Havant, but about what was best for the group. And when the group began to falter, the parts that could be cut would be cut. The vulnerability wasn't unique to Minimodels, it was structural, baked into the model of British industrial consolidation that had defined the post-war decades. Small companies sold to large ones. Large ones merged into conglomerates. Conglomerates rationalised. And rationalisation, when it came, always landed hardest on the factory floors furthest from the boardroom. Havant was not London. It was not the centre of anything. It was a works town on the south coast, making a product that generated revenue but also generated costs. Labour costs, facility costs. The friction of maintaining a large operation in a location that owed its industrial significance to decisions made years earlier by a founder who no longer controlled the company. When the arithmetic changed, Havant's case for survival would depend not on the quality of its work or the loyalty of its workforce, but on whether the numbers justified keeping the lights on. The numbers, as the 1960s drew to a close, were starting to look difficult. Before we reach the factory's final chapter, it's worth stepping back to see the larger current that was already beginning to pull at the foundations. Not of the Havant works specifically, but of the entire culture of physical play that Scalextric represented. In the early 1960s, when the Full Flood Road factory was running at its peak, children's leisure was overwhelmingly tactile. You built things. You raced things. You assembled Meccano and Airfix kits, flew balsa wood gliders, kicked footballs in the street, and, if you were lucky enough to own one, laid out Scalextric on the living room floor. The television was there, certainly, but it was shared, scheduled, and limited. 2 channels, then 3. Programs that ended and left you with nothing but a test card and silence. The screen was a window, not a world. That would change. Not overnight, and not in time to kill the Havant factory. That fate was sealed by corporate decisions, not cultural ones. But the shift that began in the late 1970s and accelerated through the 1980s would ensure that even if the factory had survived, the market it served would have been profoundly altered. The first tremor came from an unexpected direction. On the 23rd of April 1982, a small British company called Sinclair Research launched the ZX Spectrum, a home computer that cost less than a Scalextric championship set and promised something no toy manufacturer could match. Infinite variety. Load a cassette tape, wait for the screech of data transfer, and a different game appeared on the television screen. Racing games, yes, but also adventures, puzzles, simulations, worlds that existed entirely in code and light. The Spectrum didn't replace Scalextric directly. It replaced the attention that Scalextric needed. It colonised the same hours, the same rooms, the same patch of carpet where track had once been laid. The numbers tell the story more bluntly than any cultural analysis. the Spectrum sold in its millions. Its competitors, the Commodore 64, the BBC Micro, the Amstrad CPC, sold alongside it. By the mid-1980s, a generation of British children had a relationship with screens that their parents had never experienced. The television was no longer just a window, it was a portal, and the portal led somewhere more compelling, more varied, and more constantly novel than any physical toy could manage. Then came the consoles. The Nintendo Entertainment System arrived in Britain in 1987, and with it, a sophistication of graphics and gameplay that made the ZX Spectrum look like a rehearsal. The living room, that same living room where Scalextric track had once stretched from sofa to bookcase, now hosted a different kind of racing. Digital cars on digital tracks, controlled by buttons rather than rheostats, producing no smell, no click-clack, no vibration through the floor. Just light and sound from a screen. The cultural historian Tom Lean, writing about this period, described the early 1980s as the moment computers invaded British homes. The language is apt. It was an invasion, not hostile, not unwelcome, but comprehensive. And the territory it conquered was precisely the territory that Scalextric had occupied. The leisure time of children, the disposable income of parents, the space in the living room where families gathered to play. A period feature about Scalextric's collecting scene, surveying the brand's trajectory, attributed the sales pressure directly. Home computers and radio-controlled models had taken a larger and larger share of the market. It wasn't that Scalextric became worse. It was that the competition became, in the eyes of a generation raised on screens, more exciting. The smell of ozone couldn't compete with the thrill of a new game loading. The click-clack of track joints couldn't match the bleep and cascade of digital sound. This is not a moral judgment. It's not a lament for kids these days. It's a description of how attention moves, and when attention moves, spending follows. And when spending follows, the factories that made the things people used to buy find themselves making products for a market that is steadily, quietly, irreversibly shrinking. The Havant factory didn't live to see the worst of it. By the time the ZX Spectrum arrived, the works on Full Flood Road had been silent for over a decade. But the cultural shift that the Spectrum represented, the migration of play from the physical to the digital, from the floor to the screen, from the hands to the eyes, was the second death in Scalextric's story. The first death was the closure of the factory. The second was the slow erosion of the world that had made the factory necessary. We return to Havant, to Full Flood Road, to the early 1970s, when the story of Scalextric manufacturing in Hampshire came to its end. The precise date is a matter of some uncertainty, the kind of small, maddening ambiguity that haunts local industrial history. One detailed local account places the closure of the Full Flood Road factory in 1970, stating clearly that the works operated as a major employer from 1961 until that year, with approximately 1,200 people on the payroll at shutdown. Other commemorations, community posts, enthusiast retrospectives cite 1971 as the year the doors finally closed. Still others, more cautious, say simply the early 1970s. The difference of a year may seem trivial from a distance. It would not have seemed trivial to someone collecting their final wage packet. What is not in dispute is the context. The Lines brothers, Triang, collapsed into receivership in 1971. The empire that had seemed so formidable, that had absorbed Minimodels and dozens of other British toy and model companies, buckled under its own weight. Too much debt. Too many commitments. A market that had cooled faster than the boardroom had anticipated. The receivership was one of the largest corporate failures in British toy history, and it sent shockwaves through every factory, every workforce, every community that had depended on the Triang name for stability. The Havant closure sits inside that wider collapse. Whether it came just before or just after the formal receivership matters less than the pattern it represents. A local factory, employing local people, making a product that was known and loved across the country, shut down not because the product failed, but because the corporate structure above it failed. The workers at Full Flood Road didn't lose their jobs because Scalextric stopped selling. They lost them because the company that owned the company that employed them ran out of road. 1,200 people. There is no surviving account, at least none that has surfaced in the public record, of what the final day looked like. No documentary footage of the last shift. No newspaper photograph of workers leaving for the last time. The moment, if it was a single moment, went unrecorded in the way that most factory closures in Britain went unrecorded. Not with ceremony, but with paperwork. But you can imagine it. Not because imagination is a substitute for evidence, but because the pattern was repeated so many times in so many towns that its shape is familiar to anyone who lived through or grew up in the shadow of British deindustrialisation. The rumours first. Whispers on the floor weeks before anything official. Someone heard something from someone in management. Redundancy was mentioned, then denied, then mentioned again. The union reps asked questions and got answers that weren't quite answers. The canteen conversations shifted, not about football or weekend plans anymore, but about who'd been told what, and whether the night shift would be the first to go, and whether the government might step in. Then the confirmation. A notice, a meeting, a formal statement. The language would have been careful, regrettable, unavoidable, every effort. Corporate language designed to absorb blame without accepting it. The workers would have listened, and some would have felt shock, and some would have felt the grim validation of having suspected it for months. And then the machinery of closure, the rundown of production, the clearing of stores, the selling of equipment, presses, moulds, jigs, the physical tools of a trade being dismantled and dispersed, the final products coming off the line, not with pride, but with the knowledge that there would be no more after them. The last worker to leave the building, the door closed, the lights off. Silence. 1,200 people walked out of those gates for the last time and into a labour market that hadn't expected them and wasn't prepared for them. Lee Park, a community built for workers, around work, had lost its anchor employer. The shops that had relied on those wage packets felt it. The pubs that had filled up after the Friday shift felt it. The rhythm of the estate, the coming and going of shifts, the works hooter that marked the day's structure, simply stopped. What followed was not dramatic. There was no riot, no protest march, no moment of collective fury that made the national news. Havant was not Cortonwood. Full Flood Road was not a coal pit. A toy factory closing in Hampshire didn't carry the political charge of a colliery closing in Yorkshire. It was quieter than that. Smaller. The kind of loss that registers locally and fades nationally. A paragraph in the local paper, a line in the receivership report, and then nothing. But for the people who'd worked there, who'd spent their careers assembling the system that put Scalextric into British living rooms, the silence was total. The skills they'd honed were specific to a production process that no longer existed in their town. The community they'd built around the work, the friendships, the routines, the shared identity of being Minimodels people, had lost its centre of gravity. The factory didn't burn down. It wasn't bombed. It simply ceased to operate, and in time, like so many industrial sites across Britain, it was cleared and repurposed. The buildings that had housed injection moulding presses and assembly lines gave way to the generic architecture of the business park. Units, car spaces, roller shutters, the landscape of post-industrial Britain, where the question, what was here before, is met, more often than not, with a shrug. The afterlife of a factory site in Britain follows a pattern so consistent it could be printed on a template. The works closes. The site sits empty for a period, months, sometimes years, while ownership is resolved and planning permissions are sought. Then the developers arrive. The old buildings come down or are gutted and refitted. New structures go up. Low-rise, steel-framed, clad in grey or blue panels. The roads are resurfaced. The signage changes. Where once there were company names, names that meant something to the people who lived nearby, there are now unit numbers and business park brands designed to sound professional and mean nothing at all. Full Flood Road followed the pattern. Today, property literature describes it as the location of Dunsbury Business Park. The language is familiar to anyone who's ever searched for commercial premises. Modern units, flexible floor space, excellent transport links. The prose exists to attract tenants, not to preserve memory. And there is nothing in it. Not a line, not a footnote, not a plaque, to indicate that this road once held a factory where 1,200 people made a toy that defined Christmas morning for a generation. A mile to the northwest, New Lane tells the same story in a different key. The industrial area around 36 New Lane, where Scalextric was first manufactured, has seen its own redevelopment. Spring Business Park, built on the site of a former factory nearby, was completed in November 2021. Multiple, high-specification industrial units, clean lines, ample parking. A textbook regeneration project. The old factory footprint recast as a real estate product. This is not, in fairness, a scandal. Land is finite. Towns need employment. Derelict factories don't serve anyone. The redevelopment of industrial sites into business parks is a rational response to economic change. It provides jobs, different jobs, in different industries, but jobs nonetheless. The buildings are modern, efficient, fit for purpose. There is nothing wrong with Dunsbury Business Park. There is nothing wrong with Spring Business Park. But there is something lost. And the thing that's lost is not the buildings themselves. They were functional, not beautiful. But the knowledge that they were there. The memory that this particular road, in this particular town, was the place where a particular kind of work was done by a particular community of people who took a particular kind of pride in it. That memory doesn't survive in tarmac and cladding. It survives, when it survives at all, in people, and in names. There is one small, stubborn act of commemoration in the landscape around the old factory. A housing development called Fred Francis Close, named for Scalextric's inventor, located only a few hundred metres from the original works. Reports of the development describe family members attending when the first tenants moved in. A modest ceremony, a street sign bearing a name that most residents, if they're honest, probably can't place without being told. But the name is there. Fred Francis Close, a few hundred metres from where it all began. The houses are new, the street is tidy. The connection to what came before is invisible unless you know to look for it. But it's there, pressed into the infrastructure the way a maker's mark is pressed into the underside of a moulded chassis, hidden but deliberate. Someone remembered, someone insisted. It's more than most factory founders get. The broader pattern, though, is erasure, not malicious erasure. Nobody set out to delete the Scalextric factory from the landscape. But functional erasure, the kind that happens when land is more valuable as commercial space than as memorial. The kind that turns a works into a business park and a community of skilled workers into a line in a planning application. The ruins of British industry are rarely picturesque. They don't look like ruins at all. They look like car parks. And the product itself? Scalextric survived the closure of the Havant works. Production was consolidated elsewhere. Some accounts place the transfer to Margate, in Kent, following the corporate reshuffles that accompanied the Lines brothers' collapse. The brand passed through various hands. The toy continued to be designed, manufactured and sold, albeit to a market that was shrinking under the pressure of home computers, video game consoles, and the irresistible migration of children's attention from floor to screen. In 1998, Fred Francis died. He was 89. He had lived long enough to see his invention become a household name, and long enough to see the factory that first produced it fall silent and disappear. The following year, 1999, by one corporate history account, manufacturing of Scalextric was outsourced from the United Kingdom to China. The connection between the brand and British manufacturing, already frayed by the Havant closure and the subsequent relocations, was finally severed. It was not a unique story. Hornby, the model railway company that would eventually own the Scalextric brand, had moved its own production to Guangdong province in China through the mid to late 1990s, completing the transfer by 1999. The logic was the same logic that had driven every offshoring decision in British manufacturing. Lower costs, higher margins, competitive survival. The spreadsheets demanded it. The boards approved it. The factories closed. The making left Britain. The brand stayed. The gap between the two, between where the name lived and where the product was made, widened into a silence that no marketing campaign could fill. There is a community that keeps the memory alive. Not in Havant, not primarily, but scattered across the country, in spare bedrooms and garage workshops and village halls hired for the afternoon. The Scalextric collectors. The restorers. The enthusiasts who buy battered sets from car boot sales and charity shops, strip the cars back to bare chassis, repaint the bodies, replace the braids and brushes, and race them on tracks laid out with a precision that would have impressed the original factory workers. They are mostly men of a certain age. Men who received their first set in 1964 or 1971 or 1978, who remember the weight of the box, and the smell of the motors, and the specific injustice of always getting the slower car. They've carried that memory into their 60s and 70s, and they've turned it into a practice, part hobby, part restoration, part ritual remembrance of something that mattered to them when they were young, and that, in ways they might not articulate, still matters now. Swap meets and collector fairs are their gatherings. Tables covered in vintage cars, track sections, controllers, spare parts. The conversation is technical and passionate. Motor types, braid materials, chassis flex, the relative merits of 1960s tin plate versus 1970s plastic. But beneath the technical talk, there's something else. A shared understanding that what they're preserving isn't just a toy. It's a piece of the world they grew up in. A world where play was physical, where Christmas morning meant lying on the carpet, where the living room smelled of hot motors and possibility. In Havant itself, there have been efforts to preserve the local story. Community posts reference a Minimodels history project associated with the Spring, a local arts and heritage centre, and a documentary production effort aimed at capturing the memories of former employees while those memories are still available. It's the kind of grassroots preservation work that happens in towns across Britain. Voluntary, underfunded, urgent. The people who worked at Full Flood Road are in their 70s and 80s now. Their memories are the primary source material for a history that was never properly archived. When they go, what they knew goes with them. And so this story arrives at its ending, not with a verdict, but with a question. The same question that opened it, standing on New Lane, looking at a building that gives no sign of what it once contained. What happens to a place when the thing it made, the thing that gave it purpose, that employed its people, that connected it to millions of homes across the country, moves on? The brand survives. You can buy a Scalextric set today. The cars are more sophisticated than anything Fred Francis could have imagined. Digital systems, lane-changing, wireless controllers. The technology has advanced, the product endures. But the making of it is 10,000 miles away, in a factory that the people of Havant will never see, in a country most of them will never visit. The connection between the name on the box and the place where it was born has been reduced to a street sign, Fred Francis Close, and the memories of people who were there. The factory at Full Flood Road is gone. The buildings, the presses, the assembly lines, the canteen, the car park where 1,200 people arrived each morning. All of it replaced by the neutral architecture of a business park. There is nothing to indicate, to someone walking or driving past, that this was once a place where something was made that mattered. The ruin is not crumbling brick or rusted steel. The ruin is the absence of any trace at all. But memory is more stubborn than concrete. Somewhere, right now, in a house in Hampshire or Hertfordshire or the Highlands, someone is opening an old box. The cardboard is soft with age. The packaging inside is yellowed. The cars are scuffed, paint worn at the edges from 1,000 races, 1,000 crashes, 1,000 moments of a child's hand, placing a tiny vehicle into a slot with absolute concentration. They lay out the track. Click-clack, click-clack. Each joint seating with that same precise snap, the same satisfying connection, the same physical promise. This is going to work. The power unit is plugged in. The transformer hums. The car is placed in its slot, the guide dropping into the groove with a small, familiar click. And when the controller is squeezed, gently, just enough, and the car twitches into life, and the motor whines, and the air fills with that sharp, metallic scent that no one can quite name but everyone over 60 immediately recognises. For a moment, the factory isn't silent. For a moment, the living room is a racetrack again. For a moment, everything that was lost is found. Not in a building on Full Flood Road, not in a business park or a planning application, but in the smell of a small electric motor and the sound of two pieces of track joining together in a quiet room. Click, clack. The silence that follows is the loudest thing in the story.